record. I hope you guys are having a great day. And again, we've talked about you should have went through the English Reformation, you should have been through the Calvinist Reformation, and now we're going to see the Catholic Reformation. And my power mappers, when you saw the Catholic Reformation at the top, you should have balked a little bit. You should have been like, that's weird, because the Catholic Church refused to reform. If the Catholic Church reformed in 1517, we wouldn't know who Martin Luther is. We wouldn't know any of this stuff. Nothing would have happened, and Christendom would have been held in check. But instead, the Reformation is not going to happen until the 1530s. And the reason it starts is because Christendom is clearly more than just a German drunken movement. The nationalism kind of pushes up. There's chaos, anxiety. We have the Anabaptists, we have the Lutherans, we have the Anglicans, we have the Calvinists. And again, we have other sects that we're not even looking at. So by this time, there's 20 different versions, 30 different versions of Protestantism. And finally, when Calvinism starts in Geneva, right? It is in Geneva. Almost immediately, the Catholic Church realizes if they don't do anything, that schism is going to go right into Italy. Because think about where Geneva is. By people who know their maps, you know it's right next to Italy. So there's two thoughts about the Reformation. The first thought is that it's a beautiful moment that saw the revival of the good, a rise of the Jesuits, and the Council of Trent that reformed Catholic theology. It's a kind of a romantic view in the sense that they're adding value. Or we can be a little bit more skeptical, and we can look at the Catholic Reformation as nothing more than a ploy to counter the Protestant schism. The revived papacy created a reactionary policy, and I'm going to define that word in a second. A policy of shutting down any reform with the formation of the Roman Inquisition, the Index of Printed Books, and the policies of Pope Paul IV. Now, you might say, Wass, what about Pope Paul III? Well, I would argue it's really Paul IV that creates all of the chaos, and I hope you guys recognize that. But real quick, reactionary. If we're looking at the political spectrum, and let's say that's conservative and that's liberal, reactionary is way over to the right, and typically, people who are reactionary are not just conservative. They want to turn back the clock. And the reactionary Pope Paul IV wanted to ignore the Protestant schism completely. And we'll see that in a hot second. But let's go ahead and get started. All right, we got 3 slides for the revival of the true Reformation. First, you got the revival of the old. If you're a power mapper, you know how you should organize this. If you're not a power mapper, probably not really hanging out with as much. But what we got 2 M's. We got the revival of mysticism and the revival of monasticism. Okay. Now, let's look at the mysticism. Saint Teresa of Avila. She's a pretty important woman. She was a nun. She had a mystical moment with God. The ecstasy, sometimes it's called. We'll see a little bit later. I don't really have anywhere else way to say it, but let's just say her emotional connection to God overwhelmed her so much. There may have been a little bit of a family life moment where she was really excited, and this mystical moment of God brought her closer, and people believe that she was almost like enlightened. She's lit up. She is now completely one with God, and gave her a deeper faith. And here's the little painting, and what we see it. Because of that, the Carmelite nuns, and not shockingly, all the nuns, once they heard about this ecstasy she had with God, they're like, hey, that sounds kind of fun. And they want to experience the same. And it creates this mystical. So if you didn't get what mysticism is a magical, unexplainable relationship with God. In some ways, it's kind of magical. And in some ways, it's kind of like out there. If you're a mystic, people are going to think you're weird. Because it's not rational. It's the outside of reason. But again, Catholicism back in the day had a mystical flavor to it. I mean, think about transubstantiation that we kind of mentioned. That once the wine and blood are blessed, they become the literal blood and flesh of Christ. That's magical. So that magical, mystical thing is what the people were drawn to. And during the early part of the Reformation, Saint Teresa revives mysticism, which is a true revival of that old, which makes it a Reformation. Now, monasticism. Remember, guys, Rabelais. It's one of the reasons why I teach Rabelais. Remember, what book does he write? Yeah, I think I heard one person say it, Gargantua. Gargantua was that satire that really made fun of monasteries, and we pointed out that they needed to change. Well, they're going to change. what we see here is the Dominicans and Benedictines, they get back to work. Instead of serving themselves, they decide they're going to serve others. They want to explore what it really means to live the monastic life. The Capuchins, these are Franciscans who are like, wait a minute, why do we have wealth? And they sought poverty and charity. And when I say charity, in their poverty, they're going to commit charity. They're going to give to the poor. They're going to meet people's physical needs, right? So there's physical needs being fit. And then you have the Theatines. And the Theatines, they're meeting the people's spiritual needs. Let's go back to the causes of Reformation. Do you remember absenteeism and pluralism? Well, they didn't have anything good going on. People were spiritually starving. Well, now they're no longer starving, physically or spiritually. The Catholic Church, because of monasticism and mysticism, had truly been reformed. Is that cool? I hope that makes sense to you. But again, mysticism getting back to its roots, monasticism getting back to its roots, that revival is saying, hey, we're no longer going to be corrupt. And we see that with St. Teresa, Dominicans, Capuchins, and Theatines. I hope that makes sense. If not, ask questions before the quiz, of course. Now, the Society of Jesus. The Society of Jesus is a religious order created by Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola, he had been injured during the Italian Wars. He was a big, bad, toxic Maximilian guy. He's like, argh! Well, when he got injured, he began to realize maybe that's not the right way to live. And he kind of goes into a spiritual journey. And that spiritual journey, he wants to find that religious truth with a capital T. And he believed he found it in Catholicism. It was no longer just a religious empty thing. He went back and said, what does it mean to be Catholic? And in his pursuit, he published a book called Spiritual Exercises. Spiritual Exercises, if you ever go to Barnes & Noble or another religious bookstore, guess what you'll find? This book. It's still really important to Catholics. They love this book. Spiritual Exercises is about how an individual believer in Christ can get more passionately involved with him. It's about prayer, fasting. It's about the 7 sacraments. It's about the different spiritual exercises a Catholic must take to become closer to God. Really kind of important, guys. So I do hope you realize that. But that spiritual exercises, it becomes the second most important book to the Jesuits. What's the first? Of course, the Bible. Okay, so they have the Bible, they have spiritual exercises, and now Ignatius is like, hey, why don't we get together here? And in that, he establishes the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Jesuits are members of the Society of Jesus. This is a religious order that focused on educating people and spreading Catholicism. They were devout, 100% loyal to the papacy. If the Pope said the sky was purple, guess what Mr. Ignatius said? Sky was purple. Now, it didn't really matter for him. He's like, it doesn't really matter what he said the sky was, because that's not the truth. The spiritual truth is really about how we are to God. So he was 100% loyal to the Pope. I just want to make sure you understand that he was a soldier of the Reformation. But Ignatius, along with the other Jesuits, instead of killing people in the name of God, they decided to their weapon was going to be education, reason, and they wanted to go and talk people. Their goal was to revert the heretics. So instead of just bashing the Protestants, they wanted people who were thinking about becoming Protestants, they wanted to engage them and say, no, the one real religion is Catholicism. Highly successful, right? We see that, I would just tell you, they stopped the Reformation in Poland. Poland, you had the Calvinists, you had the Lutherans, you had all these different guys. Well, when the Jesuits got there, they really secured Poland. That will be kind of important when we get done with the year. In 1979, something happens, and I'm going to remind you at this moment. But clearly, they have countered the Protestant Reformation. It's not that they're fighting them, but what they're doing, they're convincing people of what they consider truth. And then look at about what happens in the spread of Catholicism as far as Japan and China. Japan was Xavier. China was Ricky, right? Now, it's not just there. They spread it all across North America and South America. If you're Hispanic, really good chance the reason you're Catholic isn't just that the Spanish were there. It's because the Spanish brought the Jesuits with them. So therefore, by the time we get to 1550, right? By the time we get to 1550, the Reformation is halted, right? They're not going to peel it back. You have the Lutherans, you got them where it's cemented. But what's going to happen is the Catholic hegemony or leadership over Southern and Eastern Europe would be secured. Really important that you see that. And again, the reason I, as a historian, see it as a true Reformation is because they're not out there just trying to bold-faced lie or convince people that the Protestants are wrong. They were there to talk to people about why Catholicism was right. They went back to the truth. They went back to their spiritual exercises, and Ignatius was able to transform Catholicism. But again, I hope that makes sense. Now, the last part, which is a little bit out of order of your power map, for me, I just did it so I wanted a nice, tight argument. True Reformation, Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was ordered by Pope Paul III. I hope you notice Pope Paul III is interesting because Dr. Spivogel says he was at the lap of the Renaissance, right? The lap of luxury. But he also was the one who was convinced to go from the corruption to Reformation. So Pope Paul III truly was a Reformation pope. And in some ways, he was going down trying to end the schism. We may mention a little bit. I do skip one or two little details. If you want to know those details, rock on. But I just want to point out, Pope Paul III called the Council of Trent in hopes to end the Protestant schism. And what they did, they went, the Catholic theologians and clergy across the continent came and met in this little Alp town called Trent. They went out and they read all of the Reformer stuff. They read the Luther stuff. They read the Anabaptist stuff. They read Anglican stuff. And they said, okay, what is the truth of Catholicism? And what they did, they said, let's cut the crap out. They cut what they considered was the corruption. They got rid of selling indulgences by 1550. Is that weird? I think it's kind of weird. Just think if they got rid of selling indulgences when Luther said it. Totally different world history. But that's not what happened. So they got rid of selling indulgence, and they got rid of some other stuff that I used to make people know it. You know one thing. It's clearly reformed. Okay? But now what we see is, look at the other things it keeps. The seven sacraments, supremacy of the papacy, faith and works, celibacy of the clergy. Those are just things. So the reason they held on to these things was because that cardinal that's going to become Pope Paul IV, he feared change. And by the time we get to 1540, Pope Paul III has kind of lost control and he dies, and then Pope Paul IV gets there. And we go, instead of all these changes, instead of bringing it together with Protestantism, rather than having a colloquy to bring it all together, you probably saw that one colloquy where there's reformers and reactionary hardliners. Well, unfortunately, for Europe and Christendom, the hardliners, the reactionaries win, and instead of negotiating, they said, this is all true, and everything else was heresy. So again, I do think there is a moment that you can argue that, well, is this really reform? Well, if you're Catholic today, you're probably thanking God that this happened, because this saved Catholicism. At the outcome of the Trent, at the Council of Trent, Catholicism was re-centralized underneath the Pope, and it's going to be able to begin to grow again. Now, that's going to change a little bit. We'll talk more about that, but I will tell you, the Council of Trent reforms Catholicism by getting rid of the corruption such as the selling indulgences while maintaining their true traditions. Seven sacraments, supremacy of the papacy, faith and works, celibacy of the clergy, and other things. And again, we'll see. Oh, of course, Latin is in the liturgy. I should put that. Is that cool? All right. Now, that's beauty. It's good. I can focus on that and say it's the greatest thing ever. Unfortunately, there's another side to this. There now is going to be a counter-reformation. And as a historian, when I talk about the counter-reformation, sometimes I think maybe some Catholics feared they were wrong. And they lived this lie their entire lives. So instead of revealing more of those lies, they're going to hunker down. And this is the reactionary part. Despite truth, despite what's happening out there, they're going to hunker down and hold on to what they consider a singular truth. I'm not being critical. It's just the moment there, no way there's going to be any more real reform. So what happens? The Index of Forbidden Books. Sometimes I'll say prohibited books. That's how I learned it. It is a Latin word that's translated. So if I say index of prohibited or index of forbidden books, it's the same thing. But let's look at what it is. It's a list of books that good Catholics could not read. If they were caught reading them, they would be sent to the Inquisition, which we're going to talk about in a hot second. The purpose, they wanted people to stop questioning Catholicism. What were some of the books that were on it? Utopia, Praise of Folly, all of Luther's works, the Institutes of Christian Religion. All of those things are outside of what is accepted Catholic truth, is rejected. So rather than allowing people to kind of question their faith and going there and going, okay, is Luther's on the Freedom of Christian Man correct? Instead of them thinking, oh, maybe that's true. Or maybe, because again, if you question something and it's false, your beliefs are stronger. No, Catholics are like, Pope's like, no way are we going to let other people question what we already know is true. And this list did exist all the way to 1966. Yep, 1966, 3 years before I was born. Yeah, I know I'm old, but think about that. From 1550s all the way to, or 1530s all the way to 1966, there were a list of books that continue to grow that good Catholics were banned to read. Now let's look at the Roman Inquisition. Roman Inquisition was a religious court who tried and tortured heretics. So you see, these are the inquisitors. This is a heretic. I'm not thinking that looks fun. It's a foot barbecue. Kind of weird. He's also being stretched a little bit. And he's being forced to confess something. This was the height of the Counter-Reformation inside of Italy. These are Anabaptists. And this is an etching that actually dates back to the day I found this primary source. And look what they're doing. The good Catholic leaders are pushing the Anabaptists to be impaled. Does that seem like a good day? They're being skewered, bad days. Rather than allowing for other people to question their faith, the Inquisition punished anyone who questioned the church theology. Once again, I will argue this is a reactionary policy in fear that they're wrong. They want to hold on to the religious truth without question. The Inquisitors are probably blaming Luther and Calvin and Henry VIII for all the chaos up north. But again, I hope you realize, I hope you kind of been paying attention. There were specific things that needed to change in the Catholic Church. I think the first three things, Council of Trent, Jesuits, and the revival, those were the ideas. They realized there had to be something changed within their theology. And then there's these other toxic people who were just saying, no change. And look at the revived papacy. And I'm going to limit this to Pope Paul IV, okay? You do need to know Pope Paul III. Please go back to this thing called your textbook. And again, if you don't like reading the one that's PDF, you can always buy it. It's less than $10 on Amazon. That'd be a smart thing to do. But I want to focus primarily on the work of Pope Paul IV. Remember, he's the reactionary Cardinal Carafa. And I might be killing his name. I apologize. But this cardinal, he is the one that said, enough change. He feared change. He believed there's any more change in the Catholic Church, all the truth would collapse and everyone in Europe were going to be bound to hell. And I do think from my understanding, I've never read a biography of this guy, but what I've studied in survey histories, it seems like this guy legitimately believes what he believes. So he's not lying to people. But again, I would argue he's just so blinded by his bias, his subjectivity, that he couldn't be objective to criticizing the things about the church. So Cardinal Carafa, basically at that one little colloquy you probably have in your notes, he said enough's enough. And the reactionary hard liners are going to win. And again, I'll show you a little political spectrum. Over here's the Protestants. Over here's the Catholics. I would argue the Catholic Church under Pope Paul III was here. They were moving towards the center. The hope was to create kind of a unity with a schism, kind of like the Council of Constance did in the previous century. No, Pope Paul IV said, heck no, this is our truth. These guys are going to hell. And what do we have now? A polarized Europe. And it's kind of sad because we're going to find out, because of this polarization and this reactionary, those hardliners that are so far to the right, we're going to see several wars. You read one this week in the French Wars of Religion. Think of how horrible those were. We're going to find out war between England and Spain called the Spanish Armada tonight in your power map. And by the end of the week, we're going to be doing this thing called the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War is in the Holy Roman Empire. It's a power vacuum, and over 1/3 of the Germans will die. It's a horrible moment. And I don't think he is the only reason, but because he's so reactionary, there is no compromise, which leads us to polarization. Rather than discussing truth, Pope Paul IV demanded complete obedience. He forced Pope Paul III to start the Inquisition and do the Index of Printed Books. Rather than the Pope critically evaluating Catholicism, he demanded the most conservative, unquestioned view. There's a couple things we can go back to, but I think that this is enough for you guys. I do think that this is enough. We're succinctly looking here. And instead of reformation, look what he does. He demands unity, and that unity is going to reject Protestantism. I do believe there's a group of reformers who are hoping within the Catholic Church that they would be able to make some moderate changes that maybe bring back parts of Germany, parts of England, and back. But instead, Pope Paul IV said there's one Catholic truth, and that one truth is worth dying for. So, was it a true Reformation or just a counter-Reformation? Your conclusion. It's your job here. It's not my job. I have my own personal answer. You may have heard it throughout it, but a Catholic may view the Reformation would see it as true Reformation. They see the beauty of what happened. They believe in transubstantiation. They believe in the seven sacraments. They believe in the beauty of Latin language. They believe in these things that are so core to their beliefs. A Protestant will see it as a counter. I mean, again, if all they see, think about the Anabaptists that were being impelled. Of course, they are not going to see it as a real Reformation. And a historian, one that tries to do it objectively, they're going to weigh both sides and draw a conclusion. I do think that that's more like me. And we would argue to what extent. Is it to a great extent a true Reformation, a moderate extent, or a limited, minimal extent? But again, I think those are your own personal answers. And that ends our class. I hope that makes sense to you. I'm going to take a second to kind of figure out where I'm supposed to be. And it's right here. Haha.